Now, a lot of people don't recognize that when you look at the first leg down in this Canadian housing market crash, it has been way more substantial than the US housing market crash in 2008. US home prices went down around 13% between 2006 and 2008. Meanwhile, in Canada, home prices went down over 20% on a national level, and they did that in less than a year. The housing bubble is already taking down the Canadian economy. Welcome to this video from Yoho National Park in BC. Yes, I've got my bear spray on me. In fact, this is probably going to be one of the most sketchy videos I've ever made because all I can hear is ice cracking and you don't know whether something's coming out at you. I got my bear spray in my left pocket here, so we're all good and we're prepared here. So anyway, I want to talk about the housing market, and what a better place than in bear country to talk about the housing market. You know, probably a lot of people think I'm just a perma bear when it comes to the housing market, and that's not the case actually. It's just because in particular the Canadian housing market is in this massive super bubble, and we hear a lot from people like the Trudeau government, Chrystia Freeland, Justin Trudeau, even Pierre, and they all talk about the housing supply issue. It's not only them either. I even hear YouTubers constantly talking about the housing supply problems. And yeah, I do not deny that there are housing supply issues in Canada, but only talking about the housing supply problem is just totally ridiculous when it comes to addressing the elephant in the room, which is the Canadian housing bubble. So when you look at the Canadian housing market and the Canadian housing bubble and how it gets to this unprecedented height that it's at right now, you have to realize that it doesn't get there without fraud, it doesn't get there without malinvestment, and it doesn't get there without hysteria. And all of those things are things we've had. You see, when you have a purely financialized housing market, you have to understand that what that means essentially is because the housing market is financialized, you will have the same emotions pulled in as any financial market. A lot of people don't really realize this or understand this about markets, but you see the same emotions playing out, and that's how I was able to predict the bull trap that we had in the housing market earlier this year, a full year in advance of that. It's not because I'm a genius, because I'm not a genius, and I cannot predict the future either. It's just because I was expecting this to play out like every other bubble, and every other bubble follows a particular cycle that I've been over many times on this channel. So when it comes to the housing market, when you hear anybody talk about housing supply being a problem, yes, they're partially right, but they're forgetting to talk about demand. Demand has been a significant problem, and part of this is to do with the CMHC, the Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation, that is supposedly there to actually help home buyers buy a home. But the reality is the CMHC basically creates massive moral hazard in the Canadian housing market, and it makes it almost impossible for people to be able to buy a home, because the thing is, essentially what the CMHC does is takes risk away from the banks through an insurance policy that they believe essentially that will just be honored no matter what. And over time you've seen exactly the same emotions that caused the housing bubble in the US housing market, which is essentially people just believe housing prices cannot and will not go down on a wide scale. Now, a lot of people don't recognize that when you look at the first leg down in this Canadian housing market crash, it has been way more substantial than the US housing market crash in 2008. US home prices went down around 13% between 2006 and 2008. Meanwhile, in Canada, home prices went down over 20% on a national level, and they did that in less than a year. So the decline was not just more severe, it was much faster than the US housing market decline. And what that illustrates to me is that we are in a housing market crash. There are still people out there, many people on YouTube, who are questioning even if this is a crash, which I just think is absolutely ludicrous. If you look around at some of the places which got really frothy, where you had home prices double, I'm talking about rural Ontario and rural BC, where you saw people speculating buying second second and third properties, buying Airbnbs, all this kind of stuff, you've seen home prices decline by 40 to 50% when you factor in inflation. And not only that, guys, the housing market is completely frozen in these places, because what happened was, and I predicted that this would happen, and again, I didn't predict that because I'm any type of genius, because I'm not. It's just because I think critically, and it was very obvious to me that this was going to happen. When you had a lot of people that were moving out, they wanted to buy a second property that was out in the country where they had more space and everything like that, they were pricing out the people in that market who could afford homes and who support the housing market there. So essentially, if they ever had to return to the office, or the Airbnb situation didn't work out for them, then guess what they would have to do? They would have to sell that property, and who would they be selling to? They'd be selling it to people who couldn't afford it. And not only that, the people who own the properties there, most of them owned them before 2021. So you have to remind yourself that a lot of these people have much smaller mortgages. So when home prices decline, they can list their house for much less than people who bought at the height of the bubble who can't afford to take a loss. And you see this all over, where housing prices have just been driven up massively. It's happened in Alberta. It's happening a little later in Alberta than other places like in Nova Scotia, where you've had buyers just inflate prices and think that everything will be fine, prices will just go up, this is undervalued. They're comparing entirely different places and entirely different economies and expecting the same result. That is just complete insanity. That is completely stupid. But that is what happens when you're in a housing market bubble. Housing bubbles are driven by human emotion and human psychology. It's how we think and how we react that drives these bubbles. The stakes are so high because these bubbles have been driven to the absolute height that people thought was not even possible. Much bigger than the housing bubble in 2008 in the US. And the worst thing is that the economy has become more dependent on the housing market than the US even did. And we saw the economic catastrophe that hit the US as a result of that massive housing bubble. It's kind of insane to me, but the Canadian housing market is responsible for more than 40% of GDP growth. Back in 2021, a lot of people were buying second and third homes. We had Better Dwelling that were reporting on this. And in fact, they put out many reports in 2022 that showed a lot of the buyers, over 30%, over 50% in a lot of these areas where home prices boomed, were buying second and third properties. And essentially, they were speculating. They thought there was no risk of buying a home. Home prices will never go down. They'd heard from the mainstream media, the politicians, the YouTubers, and they were all saying, oh, you know what, home prices are never going to go down in Canada because we've got a structural supply problem and we've got all these immigrants coming in. Problem is, nobody talks about how these immigrants are buying a home. Nobody talks about a lot of them are committing fraud. Nobody talks about that they can't afford the rents. You know, we've seen record amounts of rent increases this year in Canada. Can people afford that? Absolutely not. When you look at median incomes in places that are even higher than the national average, like Calgary, people can't afford these rents that they're paying. So as soon as an economic crisis sets in, the last person you're going to want to be is a landlord. And that is exactly what has boomed in Calgary over the past year. You've had lots of people from Ontario getting into the housing market here, buying condominiums. I know a guy who works in new construction in Calgary, and he says like over 50% of the condo sales are going unseen to people from Ontario. So just think about this. All these people right before a recession are becoming landlords. I mean, I think it's just so dumb. But once again, guys, as you know, it's an emotional market. You know, we always want to try and rationalize why the market is acting in a certain way, but we don't realize that when you're in a financial bubble, the market is largely irrational and it's running on human emotions. So it can pretty much do anything it wants at certain turns. And all you know is when you look at a bubble cycle, that is a pattern of human emotion that you see. So logically, you're likely to see the same thing. You're likely to get to fear and capitulation at some point. And we've been told time and time again that there's a supply problem and, you know, that's just going to keep home prices inflated. But like I told you, we've already seen home prices crash. I mean, the ludicrous thing about the argument to do with immigration, it's almost as bad as saying all the people coming across the southern border in the United States are going to prop up home prices in the US. I mean, it's just absolutely insane when you really think about it, but people think a lot of the people that come to Canada have loads of money. The complete opposite of that. They are mostly poor people working those lower skilled jobs, and they depend more on public services. If you're looking for a VPN, which you desperately need because of things like Bill C11, go to expressvpn.com/market mania. If you've enjoyed this video, then maybe you should check out this video here. Thank you so much for your continued support, and I will see you in the next one.